This is endgame number 9. I call it endgame because as a species, you are in your endgame now. And I'm trying to teach you to die with dignity. And let me be clear that as the doctor of Humanics, 99.83% of you are immature, dishonest attempts at becoming a human primate. So this is how I really see you. This is how really I would interact with you if you're trying to have a serious conversation with me, is you'd have to prove some form of Homo sapien operating system up here for me to start to deviate away from seeing you in this way, okay? And as the doctor of Humanics, I evaluate you for signs of humanity. And again, you might have convinced yourselves to have grown in this regard when you have not. So let me be clear that if the war ends with Russia succeeding at finishing up with a bridge to Crimea, for example, and the world saying, oh, phew, we're lucky, what a great way to end the war. I'm evaluating you based on human standards. So if this is a negotiation that either Ukraine or NATO or United Nations or anybody that claims to have achieved even a proto-civilization, if you agree to this without reparations and people going to jail, and that includes more than just the rich millionaires and billionaires, it includes the security that are taken to jail, the people petitioning in Russia. It includes everybody that participated. They will not go without consequences. Some of them might say, I had a family to feed. Okay, but you will live for at least 10 years with very controlled rations and trying to learn these human thinking tools before you have a chance to get more for your family. So we're not going to starve you. We might not put you to jail, but you are one of the bad guys. And the other thing is that every country that allowed this, with all the victims in Ukraine, if you think it's okay for Russia to spend minimum at least 75 years in hardship as a culture to show never again will we become subhuman and remain subhuman as a species, It needs to be like this. So whether they agree to this bridge or not as a way to end the war, is everybody must also agree to not do business with Russia until they clean up their own backyards for at least 75 years. Otherwise, I cannot see you as coming close to being human any more than dolphins or orangutans. Let me read something for you. By the way, I'm going to read from this. If you have a problem with me reading from this, you do not run on an Homo sapien operating system. So this is sending a message to, for example, students in Russia or outside of Russia. Anybody that's outside of Russia that identifies as a Russian identity in any way, if you're outside of Russia, you should be gathering on the internet and doing something like this, okay? Korean students in Japan produced a draft Declaration of Independence. And in Korea, it was distributed by Christians. Try not to get religion involved. Buddhists and members of, I can't pronounce that, it's another heavenly way religion, which had emerged from a particular movement. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it was decided that the declaration should be read on March 1st in Seoul, Poganda Park, along the streets near the park. Shouts of long live independence rang out. The declaration and the size and ferocity of the protests that followed it caught the Japanese by surprise. By the end of May, more than 2 million had protested. Predictably, the Japanese brutally suppressed the movement, with the result that 7,500 Koreans lost their lives and 50,000 were arrested. Yet, despite the bloodshed, And by the way, if there's bloodshed, you are not even close to running on a human operating system. And we're not talking about that long ago. The uprising eventually resulted in a new, softer Japanese administration promoting what became known as cultural rule. Officials and school teachers stopped carrying swords, and the number of military police was temporarily reduced. Korean publications were permitted, including 2 newspapers that still survive. And then it names the newspapers. Youth, religious, social, and labor organizations launched journals which encouraged a loose grouping of moderate ideologues to emerge. They established an indigenous style of literature, promoted a standardized Korean alphabet, and fought for a Korean university. In an attempt to refute Japanese cultural domination, they popularized the legend of Korea's mythical founder, Daegun. Not sure how I pronounced it. But they argued for gradual reform, and their tolerance for Japanese rule left them outmaneuvered by left-wing groups. In September 1931, the Japanese army attacked Chinese troops in Manchuria. Korea was the land bridge for this operation, and industrial plants were built to link Japan to Manchuria. Korean workers were drafted to staff Japanese factories and to work in Manchurian mines. At the same time, students were compelled to join patriotic volunteer forces, and women were enlisted to repair roads and maintain transport infrastructure. Many thousands of women were forced into frontline brothels to service Japanese soldiers as comfort women. By 1945, several million Koreans had been conscribed, if I pronounce that properly. So this is page 4041 I read, okay? So you can tell how long ago that is, and there's still cultural animosity between Koreans and Japanese. And we can say maybe 3 generations ago, there's still some very upset feelings, and I understand that because there's no structures really to heal cultures. There's no cultural repair tendencies that I've noticed in either Japan or Korea for what has happened to these women that the Japanese took advantage of. And today I still see this. I still see these patterns where you haven't grown as a species. You're still immature bullies as a species. If you can get away with stuff, and most of you stand aside and allow others to get away with stuff, then you keep going. This is how infantile you are as a species. So again, there's people taking advantage of women who may have already lost their fathers, husbands, and children are also involved in these types of victimization. The roads, buildings that have been destroyed in Ukraine should have at least 75 years of Russian people, including the ones that weren't involved, to say, I'd like to, as I identify with Russian, go in the next 75 years, spend time helping to rebuild things and to learn the counseling skills to offer trauma-type counseling. If you don't do this, I will continue to see you as an immature, failed primate species. Thank you. I want to be clear that this is where I stand. I do not represent anybody. This is who I am, and this is how I see you based on evaluating you through the scientific method.